Greetings. My name is Deborah Hurd, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of this lecture series in honor of the Department of Black Studies' 50th anniversary here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. The department opened in the fall of 1971, but its creation was the product of several years of protests and demands by Black students for, among other things, a course of study and body of research that reflected the cultural and social understandings of Black people globally and historically. On November 10th, 1969, 54 Black UNO students staged a sit-in in the president's office for his failure to address issues of racial discrimination and cultural relevance on this campus. While peacefully protesting, the police were called and all of the students were arrested. The arrest of the Omaha 54 galvanized the students and Omaha's Black community. Omaha's Black civic and social organizations and churches mobilized to bail out the 54 and to stand behind them in their negotiations with the university. One of their demands was the creation of a Department of Black Studies. And 2 years later, as a result of their continued demands on the university's administration, this department, one of the oldest in the country, came into being. And here we are 50 years later, honoring the courage and the legacy of the Omaha 54 and the continued support of Omaha's Black community. May the work of this department, which is based on the discipline's dual directive of academic research and cultural relevance, continue to honor you both. We salute you and we thank you. Secondly, as a discipline that studies, analyzes, and critiques the continuing effects of historical enslavement, colonization, land dispossession, and corporate imperialism, we cannot help but acknowledge that this university and this very city itself sit on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American people for whom this city is named, the Omaha, and that of other First Nation people who regarded this land as their communal homeland. We salute you and we stand in solidarity with you in acknowledging that the wrongs committed against you can never fully be redressed. Finally, we stand with the people of Burkina Faso, whose judiciary just last week sought to hold the killers of not only Burkina Faso's head of state, Thomas Sankara, but the killers of Burkina Faso's true independence, responsible and guilty of murder, most in absentia. This has taken nearly 35 years, and while we await extradition of those found guilty to serve their life sentences, we know that true justice will never be served, at least not in this life, because the true killers, the masterminds, are those not so hidden powers that stroke fragile egos and manipulate minds with promises of power, money, and influence in order to maintain control over the land's resources. Yet the spirit and vision of true liberation of leaders like Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba cannot be killed and will never die. We call forth their names and pray for the country of Burkina Faso to be what Thomas Sankara envisioned, and for the rise of Burkina Faso's lands of upright men and women all over Africa and in the global diaspora. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Jasmine Watkins. Dr. Watkins is an instructor in the departments of Black Studies and Psychology here at UNO. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Bowling Green State University, a Master's of Education in Educational Leadership from Wayne State University, and a PhD in Educational Psychology from Howard University. Dr. Watkins' research focuses on self-efficacy, racial identity, academic persistence and retention, and African-centered education. She is a reviewer for the Journal of Negro Education and serves as faculty advisor for the UNO student group, Black Excellence. Welcome, Dr. Watkins.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so before I turn it over to you, I do have a few questions to ask you. This is just how we begin. What made you choose to study psychology as an undergrad?
I like to think of it as psychology choosing me. when I first went to undergraduate college, I majored in math, pure math, not math education. And my minor was psychology due to having one psychology course or class in high school. And my last year, I had an instructor that had a thick accent, and I was just so focused on getting a 4.0 that I switched my major from math to psychology just so I can keep a high GPA. In hindsight, I probably should have just stuck it out, but that's how I got into majoring in psychology.
But you brought that math in too, so that's interesting.
Yes, I love numbers. So yes, I still had to weave in math even in doctoral school.
Okay. So who are some of the scholars in the field of Black psychology that have inspired you?
There are so many. I just would like to highlight Dr. Thomas Asa Hilliard. Dr. Hilliard is or was a master teacher. He was pivotal or very influential in promoting African-centered psychology. He was a professor at Georgia State University before his untimely demise, unfortunately, but he really focused on eliminating test bias in children. And I really identify with that just from my own experience, kind of not being the best test taker. So I really related to that. And he was actually a founding member of ASCAD, the Association for the Study of Classical Civilization. And I just appreciate all of his work, particularly on ancient Egypt or, ancient Africa.
And the final question I have, and this will be the segue for me turning it over to you. How did you decide on this topic for your dissertation?
Yeah, I had a lot of different topics. I first wanted to do character education. Then I switched to self-determination, which is a motivation theory. But as I was writing on these different topics, I just found myself questioning my ability. And so then I decided, hey, I need more confidence. So why not study confidence? So essentially, that's kind of what self-efficacy is. And so I just decided to study the development of self-efficacy, just so it can help me get more self-confidence. So with that being said, I would like to pull up my okay, thank you so much. So the title, well, I am happy to be here with you all today. The title of my presentation is An Investigation of the Predictors of Mathematics of Efficacy in Black College Freshmen on a Predominantly Black Campus. So on the next slide, we just have a quick overview. And so this presentation will start with the introduction section, and it will conclude with the discussion section with the background, the review of the literature, the methodology, and the results sections in the middle. So what is the problem? The association or the acquisition of a bachelor's degree is associated with financial freedom and shield for the long haul of adequate survival in the United States. However, students are dropping out of school at disappointing rates, dropping out of undergraduate college specifically at disappointing rates. Unfortunately, the US loses societal supports and billions of dollars when students fail to graduate, with costs reflected in terms of productivity and tax revenues, criminal justice systems, and public assistance. So what is behind the increase in America's college dropout crisis? It is important to note that students discontinue college for multiple reasons, such as academic grades, affordability, motivation, and low self-efficacy. And in my opinion, the educational field should focus on self-efficacy because it impacts cognition, behavior. It impacts cognition and behavior by activating the choices students demonstrate, the effort executed, personal goals, and persistence with accomplishing difficult tasks. So at this point, you may be wondering, if you are not already familiar with the jargon or with this concept, you may be wondering what exactly is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy can be described as one's belief in their own capabilities to organize and execute the actions required to produce particular attainments. And this belief is usually pertinent to new, ambiguous, or repeatedly stressful occurrences. So that is the definition of self-efficacy. And the next slide, we are continuing with the problem. And so now that we know the definition of self-efficacy, how is self-efficacy formed? And are there any shortcomings of the self-efficacy literature? Surprise, surprise, there are a lot of shortcomings, but let's just focus on the formation of self-efficacy beliefs first. So Albert Bandura, in 1997 contended that the formation of self-efficacy is influenced by 4 distinct sources. We have inactive mastery experiences, which, for example, are previous performances. We have vicarious, and these sources are in no particular order. The second source is vicarious experiences. So an example of that is modeling. A third source is verbal persuasions or social persuasions. So that's like messages from others or feedback, praise, things like that. The fourth source, the last source is emotional state or physiological arousal. So that could be depression, anxiety, and so forth. So those are the 4 sources that form self-efficacy. And so in the literature, Bandura argued that mastery experiences, past performances, are the most powerful and consistent message sources because they are an individual's own experiences. For example, if I previously got an A in math, then I'm going to be confident that I can do it again. So that's just one example of past performance as a source of self-efficacy. However, based on my search of the literature, only one study had majority Black college students when assessing the sources of math self-efficacy, and mastery experience was not considered the most powerful predictor of math self-efficacy in this case. So let's go to the next slide, where I'm going to get into the meat and potatoes of the purpose of my study. The purpose of my study, the sources of math self-efficacy have been insufficiently investigated in Black college students, particularly on a predominantly Black campus, in efforts to identify who may be at risk for dropping out of college due to math courses being linked to academic achievement and self-efficacy beliefs being linked to academic achievement. So the main purpose of this study is to extend Gaynor and Lentz study. A little over 20 years ago, in 1998, Gaynor and Lentz conducted a study, and I wanted to replicate this study because it was the only study examining the sources of math self-efficacy that included majority Black college students, but their study was conducted on a predominantly white campus. And so I just wanted to replicate the study on a historically or a predominantly Black campus to see if there were any differences at all. And so in Gaynor and Lentz study, about a little over 20 years ago, mastery experience was not found to be the most influential predictor of math self-efficacy. And so I am determined, or the goal of this research was to determine whether this finding was still true for students attending an HBCU almost 20 years later. So for the purpose of this study, the role of mathematics sources predicting self-efficacy is warranted because few studies address the powerful function of mastery experiences, which are past performances, and vicarious experiences on the advancement of math self-efficacy. So simply put, more research is needed regarding the most influential source of math self-efficacy for Black college students on attending an HBCU. And so research findings show limited studies on the predictors or the antecedents of self-efficacy, despite the robust relationship between academic performance and self-efficacy, particularly when it comes to various groups of self-identified Black students. So not just Black Americans, but African students or students that have roots or connections with the continent, and even Caribbean and West Indies students. So I really, instead of comparing Black students to white students, I decided to look at within group differences and to see if there's any difference between Caribbean students, West Indies students, African students, and Black Americans. And I did triangulate the data with both quantitative and qualitative. So I do have some complementary survey data where students provided short answers to open-ended questions. But for the purpose of this research study, or for the purpose of this presentation, I would just focus on my quantitative results. So on the next slide, we have the research questions and hypotheses. And so pretty much 1 and 2 are pretty much the same research questions. The only difference is the way that math self-efficacy was measured. So I used 2 different questionnaires or 2 different scales just to really make sure or confirm the findings and make sure they were reliable and valid. So the first research question states, which of the following sources is the best predictor of math self-efficacy for learning and performance? And then the second one, which of the following sources is the best predictor of math course self-efficacy? And so math course self-efficacy was pretty much measured, it assessed the confidence beliefs that students held about their ability to get an A or a B or better in about 15 math courses. So on the questionnaire scale, they listed like statistics, calculus. They had about 15 math courses, and students rated their ability or their confidence in their ability to get a B or better in those particular 15 courses. And then the second way that I measured math self-efficacy was from the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire. This questionnaire been around for over 25 years at this point. And so it is very reliable and valid. And so one of the questions from that survey, for example, is, I'm certain I can understand the most difficult material presented in the readings for this course. And another sample item is, I'm confident I can understand the most complex material presented by the instructor in this course. So those are just a few items from that questionnaire. And I could give you the Cronbach's alpha, which just really just is showing that it is measuring what it is intended to measure. It is reliable and it is valid. But for the sake of time, I'll just move on to the to the next slide, which has the very last quantitative research question, and that's where I investigated within group differences. So does ethnicity influence the sources of math self-efficacy of college freshmen? And so now we will get into the theoretical framework that helped to guide this investigation. The last two research questions were qualitative, so I'm going to skip it for now, but let's just move on to the theoretical framework. And so according to Albert Bandura, social cognitive theory that he coined back in 1977, the social cognitive theory is one in the psychology field, of course, it is one of the most renowned theories that attempt to explain the practices that propel and control behavior, which is based on a pattern of inward self-choice considerations and outward societal structures forcing and governing conduct. So in the late 1970s, Albert Bandura engineered the concept and term personal self-efficacy in his noteworthy article and suggested the substantial role of individuals being able to engage in self-referent thinking. And all of that affects future behaviors. So simply put, those with high self-efficacy assertions generally pursue more daring endeavors. They tend to decidedly review their growth more regularly. They examine their time on task more carefully. They partake in more self-motorized approaches and are more resourceful at settling drawbacks and exert more effort that advocate for academic profits and choices than individuals with low self-efficacy. So competence beliefs or self-efficacy can influence a person to carry out specific tasks by enacting the choice of activity, the amount of effort employed, the degree of persistence and perseverance applied, regardless of barriers, feelings of anxiety or tranquility, self-regulatory tactics, and performance goals, especially when adverse experiences and problems surface. So as a result, self-efficacy is recognized as an indispensable construct in support of success because it is a major determinant of movement based on an individual's conception regarding their own strength. And it is important to note here that self-efficacy is task specific. So I may have high self-efficacy in math, but low self-efficacy in singing. So I just wanted to point that out, that just because you have it in one subject or one area is not universally applied to other areas. So on the next slide, it's pretty much a visual representation of how self-efficacy beliefs are developed, and then how self-efficacy beliefs influence individuals' behavior and performance. So as you can see, we have performance experiences, which are previous successes and failures, experiences on a similar task. So if a student previously did not do well in math, then their confidence in their belief to do well in math the next grade year may be hindered due to the previous performances they had. And so observational learning or vicarious experiences are observations of the behavior and consequences of similar models. So a lot of times students learn by just watching others, but when the student identifies that particular model as being similar to them, whether it is in age, whether it is in ethnicity, all of that help the student to identify with the model. So similarity is important. And the third source is verbal persuasion, which pretty much is encouraging or discouraging messages from others. And the fourth source, emotional arousal. Arousal that can be interpreted as enthusiasm or anxiety. So these four sources all contribute to the development of self-efficacy beliefs. And as a result, self-efficacy beliefs, which is your belief in your capability to execute a particular task, all of that impacts one's behavior and performance in school and out of school. All right, so let's just review that literature of the sources quickly before we actually get into the meat and potatoes of the study. So the purpose of this slide is to pretty much just state that inactive mastery experiences or past performance is considered the most strongest and influential source of math self-efficacy when you review the literature. And this is across contexts, across grades, across ethnicities, across academic subjects. Majority, if not all of the literature states that mastery experiences, past performance is the strongest predictor of self-efficacy. Nonetheless, the findings from these studies should be interpreted with caution. Why? Because none of them include primarily Black college students on a predominantly Black campus, despite researchers noting the importance of contextual factors like gender, domain, values, ability, culture, ethnicity, and so forth in influencing the sources of self-efficacy when interpreting the results. And unsurprisingly, most of the research on self-efficacy includes primarily middle-class white people as participants, and psychology in general include primarily middle-class white people as participants. So as a result, we cannot generalize the findings to Black students if we were not included in the actual study, right? All right, so now I'm going to just dive into explaining a little bit more. Oh, sorry, let's go back one more. I'm going to give a little bit more detail about the sources. So Bandura in 1997 emphasized that the same level of performance successes may raise, leave unaffected, or lower perceived self-efficacy depending on how various personal and situational contributions are interpreted and weighed. In other words, inclinations can be managed based on ecological practices or inheritance. So research expresses students' mastery, repertoire, experience. They are more meaningful drivers of self-efficacy than objective performance. So students' past performances are drivers of their self-efficacy beliefs over GPA, for example, as a result of providing tangible and authentic experiences regarding task attainment in particular domains. So above all, Bandura and other colleagues have declared that mastery experience source is the strongest and most consistent predictor of self-efficacy when managing a series of certain conditions compared to the remaining three sources for males and females amidst several educational levels. So regardless of age group, regardless of subject, regardless of all of these other criteria, past performance or mastery experience in the research have always proven to be the strongest, most powerful, robust predictor of self-efficacy. And that is regardless of methodological considerations. So it didn't even matter if the study was quantitative or qualitative. All of the research says that mastery experiences are the most robust, powerful, strongest predictor of self-efficacy and less predictive of efficacy expectations than performance-based information in which learners develop perceptions of their capabilities by prospectively observing and reflecting on information and actions transmitted through social models in a specific activity. So proficient models build self-beliefs of capability by conveying to the observers the effective strategies for managing different situations. So that was about vicarious experience. Now let's just briefly talk about the third source, messages from others, or verbal persuasion. So verbal persuasion can be defined as opinions, constructive suggestions, evaluative feedback, and assessments regarding one's participation in a specific task from significant critics. So students' efficacy beliefs can be enhanced or diminished based on cognitive judgments from other individuals or entities, such as peers, such as parents, such as school practitioners, or even the media. So it is easier to sustain a sense of efficacy, especially when struggling with difficulties, if significant others express faith in one's capabilities than if they convey doubts. So that is the third source, messages from others. And last but not least, the fourth source, emotional state or physiological arousal. Social psychologists describe the fourth source as individuals' awareness and explanations of their bodily and in their emotional reactions, such as disposition and their focus preference to these conditions as physiological arousal. For example, in short, being conscious of one's feelings, their physical sensations, their mood, their emotional biases like stress or fatigue or tension or pain or anxiety or just their overall composure while completing a specific task, students interpret that as whether or not they are competent in completing that particular task. So Bandura maintained that the weights assigned to different types of ethnicity information may vary across domains and functioning. So in other words, confidence beliefs are domain specific. In some studies, contrary results were found, of course, but for instance, in Gaynor and Lent's study in 1998, they found that mastery experience did not significantly predict math self-efficacy for Black undergraduates. But strikingly, they found that it was related to social persuasions or messages from others, which is why that was my hypothesis. My hypothesis was that the strong efficacy would be messages from others, social persuasion, due to the findings that Gaynor and Lent found in their research, which was the only study that had a majority Black college population that investigated math self-efficacy. All right, so let's move on to the dependent variable. So at this point, you may be asking why math? And the short version is a lot of universities and colleges use math as a weed out class to weed out the ones that they don't think will be able to successfully version, but let's get into it. So research has shown that federal policymakers in the United States are interested in the low involvement.
Dr. Watkins,
yes.
Can you back up a second? You froze for a little bit.
Okay.
So you were saying something about the success?
Okay, on this slide or?
Yes.
Okay. So why are we studying math self-efficacy? Math self-efficacy math courses are used by a lot of universities as a weed out, to weed out students who may be deemed unable to successfully matriculate to college or to graduation. So research has shown that federal policymakers in the United States are interested in the low involvement of some racial and ethnic groups and women as it relevantly relates to successful STEM occupational routes. So it is important to focus on the subject of math rather than other content areas for multiple reasons, such as Black students' unfavorable tendency to perform poorly in math-related fields due to the competitive drive released from such atmospheres as a result of dealing with the stereotype threat. And the stereotype threat is when Black students face the threat of confirming or being judged by a negative stereotype or a suspicion about their group's intellectual ability and competence. So for instance, domains regarded as using high math understanding and concentration, for example, that is your computer science, your engineering, your economics courses, they are all amped to have more rigorous programs and weed out classes to identify less competent students. So in college, it is vital for students to avoid dodging math courses. Some students, they want to dodge math courses, but that's not the way to go, because you need math courses. So in college, dodging mathematics and associated classes can critically hinder the potential scope of occupational opportunities. So findings show that Black students do in fact desire math-related careers and fields more than white students, despite being nearly excluded from math-oriented professions in the workforce. So in general, that is why the dependent variable is math self-efficacy, because a lot of universities use it to use math courses to identify less competent students. And so we want to help those students. So let's just summarize before we get into the methods and how I actually went about investigating this topic. Let's just do an overall summary of what the literature says so far. So we're going to go to the next slide, summary of literature review. So cognitive processing of the 4 modalities or the 4 sources of encouragement play an important and complex role for swaying students' coherent sense of self-efficacy, such as how information is singled out, attended to, and well combined. So unfortunately, majority of educational research studies examining self-efficacy and the predictors of self-efficacy include white participants from middle-class upbringings to assess their way of behaving and their viewpoints. And this limited variety in the sample of participants included in empirical research makes the results from such studies ungeneralizable. We cannot generalize to individuals not included. And so according to Nora and Kabar in 1996, students of color hold markedly distinct experiences compared to white students. Black students may have a more natural proclivity towards an other orientation as opposed to the self-orientation as a result of being of African-American descent. So although it is important to note that differences in self-efficacy and self-efficacy predictors do exist within groups as well. So not just Black versus white, but even looking at comparing African students with Caribbean students, for example. And so I just want to just take a quick pause to highlight that there is no one size fits all path as it relates to modifying learners' self-efficacy. According to Usher and Pajaris in their 2008 study, they postulated that studies of the sources of self-efficacy will be enriched by attending to students' habits of thinking and their predispositions toward viewing the world and their perceptions about school, learning, and their academic selves, which is the goal of this study. So simply put, the current study seeks out to determine whether the influence of self-efficacy predictors differ as a result of ethnicity or racial group membership, due to most of the studies with majority ethnic participants reporting an antecedent other than mastery experience. So all of that pretty much just says that all of the studies that had majority white participants, they found mastery experience, past performances to be the strongest predictor of self-efficacy. But the only study that had a majority Black population, they did not find mastery experience to be the strongest, most powerful, robust predictor. In fact, it was social and verbal persuasion. All righty, so now we are moving on to the methods section. So let's just talk about the participants for a second. In this study, there were about 127 participants, and they were recruited from a private HBCU in the Mid-Atlantic region. And a convenient sample was taken from the freshman seminar course and their undergraduate math courses. Because I wanted to specifically look at college freshmen, I recruited students from freshman seminar since it was a mandatory course at that particular university. And I also recruited students from directly from their math course that they were enrolled in during that particular semester. So before completing the questionnaire on SurveyMonkey, I used SurveyMonkey, which is an online platform to distribute and collect data. Before students were able to start my study, I had 3 criteria. So the 3 criteria was you had to be a current, your status had to be freshman. So current freshman status. And the 3 criteria, you had to be a freshman, you had to self-identify as either African-American, African, or Caribbean / West Indies. And lastly, you had to currently be enrolled in a math course. So once you started the SurveyMonkey, if you did not fulfill those 3 criteria, you would still be eligible for the gift card. You just couldn't complete the study because you didn't meet the criteria. So let's just define freshman status quickly. The freshman status is the freshman status is defined as the first year full-time non-transfer student attending college for the first time, and only students who identified as freshmen were included in the analyses. And I just wanted to point out that students were given the option to provide their email address, so they had an opportunity to receive one of 10 Amazon gift cards, and the denomination was $20. Okay, so these are the measures. So I use, on the next slide, we have the different measures. So the first measure was a demographic questionnaire that I self-created. The demographic questionnaire is a self-report form that was specifically developed for this study, and it asks participants to identify specific characteristics about themselves. For example, they identify their major, their gender, age, high school GPA, their ethnicity, their self-reported social class, their hometown, the geographical area of their hometown, whether they had advanced or honor math courses in high school, whether they were a first-generation college student, and even the educational level of their parents. So I just wanted to see if any of that contributed to the findings. And I did briefly go over the different math efficacy scales earlier. So the one scale, the motivated strategies for learning questionnaire. It was used to assess college students' motivational orientations and their use of different learning strategies, specifically when it came to self-efficacy. And that particular self-efficacy scale had about 7 items, and they all got at the construct self-efficacy. I don't want to spend too much time on going over it, just for the sake of time. But I do want to highlight the sources of math self-efficacy questionnaire that was created by Gaynor and Lent back in 1991. It has high reliability. And one example, I'm going to provide an example of each of the sources from that particular questionnaire. So for the sources of math self-efficacy, one of the items include, I received good grades in my high school classes. So that would be an example of mastery experiences or past performance. An example of vicarious experience is, my favorite teachers were usually math teachers. So that's an example of vicarious experience. An example of verbal or social persuasion is, my friends discouraged me from taking math classes. And last but not least, an example of emotional or physiological state is, I get really uptight while taking math tests. So those are just some of the questionnaire items that students read over, and this was on a Likert scale ranging from 1 to 5, and so students rated from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so let's move on to the data collection efforts. So what I did was I distributed an email, and inside that email, it had the link to the survey that was posted on SurveyMonkey. And I just used the Blackboard listserv for freshman seminar, since of course it was a mandatory course for all freshmen. So all students enrolled in the College of Arts and Sciences freshman seminar course did in fact receive an opportunity to participate in this study. And students were allowed to refuse to participate in the study and not be penalized. And confidentiality was upheld. So no personal identifier such as the name or school ID was on the questionnaires. And so the data for this study was collected directly from students' online self-reports via SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is an online platform that allows researchers to efficiently disseminate surveys online. Appropriate instruments were entered directly onto the SurveyMonkey platform, and freshman participants were emailed a link to voluntarily complete the study. All right, so on the next slide, we will get into the actual research design. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a mini mixed method study because I used both quantitative data from the self-reports, and I assessed 2 open-ended qualitative questions to triangulate the data. But let's just only go over the quantitative data. So a non-experimental design was used because I could not control. It couldn't be a survey because you cannot control or manipulate or alter any of the predictors or any of the sources of math self-efficacy. But instead, I relied on the interpretation, the observation, or the interaction to come to a conclusion. And typically this means the non-experimental researcher must rely on correlations, surveys, or case studies, and cannot demonstrate a true cause and effect relationship. And so non-experimental research tends to have a high level of external validity, meaning that it can be generalized to a larger population. Because as we know, when you conduct a survey, you are really restricting or you're controlling for a lot. And in order to generalize those results, you would have to have those same controls. But in this case, we can generalize the results because we don't have many controls. And so a non-experimental design was used to investigate the quantitative and qualitative research questions in this study, both empirically and in participants' own words. And so let's just move on to the next slide, which is, again, a visual representation of the variables used, the hypotheses, the questionnaires, and the statistical procedures. I hope you can see that. So for research questions 1 and 2, a multiple regression was used. And for the last research question, where the hypothesis was there will be a significant difference in the sources of math self-efficacy of college freshmen among African Americans and African and West Indies students, I used a MANOVA for that because there were multiple dependent variables. So in this case, the sources or the predictors of self-efficacy, which include mastery experience, vicarious experience, social and verbal persuasion, and emotional state, those were the dependent variables. And I wanted to see whether ethnicity impacted the source. And so I used a MANOVA. Alrighty, so on the next slide, we actually have the results. So there were, so all participants completed an informed consent. Informed consent was obtained from all participants, and there were a total of 127 cases were included in the final analyses. The sample consisted of more females. So the study had about 82% females, and then 16% males, and about 2% chose to not disclose their gender. And so majority of the participants they reported to be 18 years old. So about 75% of participants reported being 18 years old. The sample's ethnicity was made up of 53% African American and 47% African and West Indies. And so the average high school cumulative grade point average was a 3.5. And this is all just the demographic. This is all from the demographics survey. And so biology was reported as the most popular major among all of the participants. And all of the participants reported their enrollment status in college as full-time. So on the next slide, we're going to actually get into the results. So unfortunately, low reliability of vicarious experience was found. And that was probably due to the multifaceted nature of this source. So eventually I took it out of the analyses because that's what the statistics call for. That's what the procedure called for. It just wasn't enough there. And so the assumption is that this particular source is better to measure it amongst their peers rather than adults. So that is perhaps why there was low reliability with the vicarious experience, because it's better to have students answer those questions in regards to their peers as opposed to adults. And so when doing a descriptive analysis, so that's like the mean, median, and mode, social persuasion, in fact, had the highest mean among all of the remaining sources, which kind of gets at my hypothesis a little bit. However, the only predictor that had statistically significant regression coefficient was emotional state on the sources of mathematics self-efficacy scale for both of the scales. So on both, remember I had I measured math self-efficacy 2 different ways from 2 different from two different surveys. And so the only predictor that was statistically significant on both of the math self-efficacy skills was emotional state or physiological arousal. And so it is important to note that greater scores on each subscale, so for example, mastery experience, social persuasion, and emotional state, indicated more favorable former involvements. So they had more accomplishments and lower anxiety because these scores were formed by summing the item responses after reversing the scores of the negatively worded items. All right, so this is the last slide of the results, and then we'll actually get into some more fun stuff. All right, so pretty much what this slide is stating is that in a standard multiple regression, the significance of the analysis is described by the range of variance or the coefficient of determination. So in this particular study, it indicates that 46% of Black college freshmen math self-efficacy, so their belief and their ability to execute a particular task in math, for example, it was predicted by mastery experience, social persuasion, and emotional state and ethnic identity. So the results of the regression showed that the three independent variables, the mastery experience, the social persuasion, and the emotional state, they explain 45% of the variance in math self-efficacy for learning and performance, and 46 of the variance for math course self-efficacy. So all of that is to say that students born in the United States do not differ significantly on the research variables from those born abroad or with ties to other countries. The univariate results were not of importance due to the non-significant multivariate results, which showed that there was no significant difference in how different racial groups related their sources of math self-efficacy. And even though this was another non-significant result, I just want to highlight that a one-way maneuver was conducted to test the hypothesis that there would be a mean difference between majors. So I wanted to compare STEM majors versus non-STEM and the sources of math self-efficacy. But so to see if STEM versus non-STEM majors, whether they had a different predictors of math self-efficacy, and that was not statistically significant. So mastery experience and emotional state did in fact have the highest Pearson correlation, and mastery experience and verbal persuasion had the lowest Pearson correlation associated with the sources of math self-efficacy. And so we're going to move on to the discussion. So 59% of undergraduate students who began seeking a bachelor's degree at a four-year institution in fall 2009 completed a bachelor's degree by 2015 at the same institution where they started in 2009. And that is from the National Center of Education Statistics from 2017. So essentially 60% of students completed their degree from a four-year institution, and it took about 6 years. So the results from my investigation did in fact affirm Gaynor and Lentz 1998 study, where it was revealed that mastery experience was not found to be the strongest source of math self-efficacy with a sample of majority Black undergraduate students at a predominantly white institution. In keeping up with research, including majority HBCU students, performance accomplishments are not the strongest source of academic self-efficacy. And so the findings, in fact, support the current emotional and physiological state as being a significant predictor of math self-efficacy for learning and performance and for math course self-efficacy. And research questions 1 and 2 support the overall argument that Black college students on a predominantly Black campus tend to form their math self-efficacy beliefs based on emotional and physiological arousal. For instance, Black students enrolled at HBCUs show more emotional dependence by counting on their own ideas and views more and focusing less on the endorsement of others. And so it is important to know that the predictors of math self-efficacy do not perform in privacy or in isolation. So Black students are the non-white student group who are frequently subjected to minimum scholastic or academic achievement in various academic contexts as a result of high suspension rates, low graduation rates, low test scores, and high enrollment in special educations, to name a few of the negative outcomes. So we see Black students enrolled in special ed courses more often than we do the advanced placement or the gifted and talented classes. Therefore, learning is predicated on cultural practices across context and time, according to an expanding multidisciplinary agreement. So let's move on to, this is the second to last slide of the intro or to the discussion. Then we'll move on to the recommendations and the implications from this study. So it may well be the case that HBCUs present these positive reinforcements to students as they advance through college in order to purposefully offer a stronger array of choices for those students. So affect is one of the most widely acknowledged and important features of Black culture. Black learners express a more heightened sense of emotional arousal than their white counterparts, according to Usher in 2008. Middle schoolers. So one reason that the emotional arousal or the physiological state was the only source to be statistically significant, perhaps could be due to either the stereotype threat or the imposter syndrome. And stereotype threat pretty much states that when a stereotype is made salient or obvious, that an individual will behave incongruent with that stereotype. And because we already know a lot of research, a lot of media perpetuate that Blacks have low intellect, then students may behave in alignment with that stereotype, particularly when it comes to math and other STEM-related courses. So the learning conditions of the classroom environment can stimulate numerous emotions, such as joy for gaining knowledge, the desire for achievement, fear of inadequate academic performance on an assessment, disappointment in educational context, pride in successes, or anger around assignment expectations in technology-centered and traditional school settings. For example, Fong and Cruz in 2014 discovered that anxiety or burdens related to the academic world, they reported that as the most commonly reported emotional condition that can hamper efficacy building, as revealed in a small number of underachievers research log records. And I know I'm coming up on just about 1 hour, so I'm going to just try to move quickly. So the next slide has the recommendations for future studies that want to investigate the predictors of math self-efficacy. So one recommendation is to extend beyond HBCUs, but to also look at other academic institutions, for example, Hispanic serving institutions. And in this investigation, I only looked at math, but it would be beneficial to look at other academic areas like science and writing and English. And it would be beneficial to researchers to examine this study for a longer period, because I only did it in like a snapshot one semester, but it would be more advantageous to look at 3 to 4 semesters, particularly when it comes to freshmen, because they are still figuring out where their strengths lie. And also it would be beneficial to look at more pre-college experiences. For example, participation in gifted and talented programs. And another recommendation is to advocate for new sources in the digital world. So because this Bandura study, he created the sources of self-efficacy years ago, but now we're in 2022. So what new sources or predictors of self-efficacy exist? And it is important to even look at grades to see how a gradeless environment, how that can reduce stress. Because I am aware in some educational environments, like it's escaping me right now, but they don't use grades. They have a gradeless system. It's on the tip of my tongue. And the last recommendation is to examine ethnic identity. So to actually use an identity scale, because Gaynor and Lent found that racial identity attitudes minimally related to the social cognitive variables. All right, so the second to last slide are the implications. And pretty much in a nutshell, the implications are for teacher education programs to be more focused on understanding students' feelings and emotional state, because emotional states such as mood, anxiety, and stress impact academic self-efficacy. It would seem to be important to support research on how students' social and learning environments predict their emotional arousal and their self-efficacy development. So exposing students to diverse learning opportunities like the library, the museums, social media and games, and religious organizations and government mandated programs are all examples of several influences affecting development of self-efficacy and ultimately impacting the predictors of personal capability beliefs. In other words, one's environment impacts their affect or their feelings. And I will stop here. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Dr. Watkins. You gave us a lot to think about. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to get to those real quickly because we're at time just about. Professor Karen Johns asked, what can we do to prepare our African Americans for math? Is learning the basic facts a good start?
The basic facts of math?
Yes, I guess basic math facts.
Yes. So really, the purpose of this investigation was to see which predictor of self-efficacy had the strongest impact. So all of those sources, the mastery experience, the social persuasion, verbal persuasion, vicarious experience, and emotional state, all of that contribute to one's beliefs and their ability to perform well in math. But this study really said that emotional state, for example, anxiety, had the strongest impact. So if we are able to build in to instruction ways to ease or alleviate feelings of, let's say, anxiety when it comes to math courses or stress, then that would be ideal. So if you can create small wins, incrementally small successes, that would definitely help to reduce stress and anxiety when it comes to math courses. And all of that will then help with the confidence beliefs.
All right, and we have a question from Professor Terry Crawford. Can you talk about the vital role of pipeline paths to STEM and AP math classes for Black students in P through 12, and the role those teachers should play in nourishing the interest and the mastery, since many of the AP decisions are made by teacher referrals?
Yeah, so that's why the implications at the end, and I went over some of them, but definitely the implication is to improve how these teachers are being trained and educated to be in front of our students. And unfortunately, some teachers do come into the classroom with a lot of biases, and they are represented in the high suspension rates, the high referrals to special education, the low referrals to the AP courses, and all of that. So once we help to improve how these teachers are trained, then hopefully we will see some improvement in how students are treated, which ultimately impacts their competence beliefs.
So that raised a quick question for me. In considering, so you looked at them during their freshman year, but how much of that anxiety did they bring with them? And how much of that self-confidence did they bring with them from elementary, middle school, and high school?
Yeah, so that was a slight limitation of the study because I measured the freshmen at the end of their first semester. So they really haven't had that much time or experience to develop how well they would do in college, or they only really had one semester's worth. So that is a slight limitation. So to your point, in future research on this topic, I did recommend or propose to look at more than just a snapshot of just one semester, but to do a more longitudinal study where we even seeing, or even like a pre and post to even see, do these predictors change over, do these sources of math efficacy, do they change over time? Or how does that look at when they're a senior? Or even to compare freshman sources of self-efficacy to a senior's source of self-efficacy. So that is a good point. And on the demographic questionnaire, I did have 1 or 2 questions about their pre-college experience, like were they involved in any math extracurricular activities in their previous school setting and stuff like that. But definitely a more thorough investigation, extending the time periods to 3 to 4 months is ideal, and not just math, but other STEM subjects as well.
Yeah, I mean, it just made me think about, I guess, my own kind of math experience, because I had older teachers. So most of my teachers were at retirement age, but they were old school, you know, kind of, you need to try to work it out yourself before we go over it in class. And so we kind of got that ingrained in us. So I'm just kind of wondering if you came in an environment where you were afraid to ask questions, you were lost in high school, does that create that anxiety as opposed to when you're trained to try to work it out yourself and you're given that confidence to kind of do it yourself? Even if you're in a new environment, would you kind of carry that kind of confidence that I can't figure it out myself? Does that kind of carry over? So that I was just curious about that. Yeah, did you want to respond?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So that is what the emotional and physiological source. It pretty much measures the student's interpretation of these particular emotions. So as they are completing, let's say, math problems, and whatever emotion that they are feeling, how that is interpreted. If they're tense, then they are interpreting it negatively and vice versa. So yes.
All right, so we have one last question. Nicole Enfant, are you familiar with Christopher Jett's work? I think your work is complementary and could build off each other.
No, but in my presentation, I did forget to mention Bob Moses. And so he pretty much founded the Algebra Project. And it just speaks to how in this country, in the United States, as opposed to France, we have decided to use algebra as the go-to standard for math. And the golden standard, if you cannot do a particular math, then yeah, you are not deemed to be efficient. So no, I would have to do more research in that regard. But Bob Moses, he's responsible for training a lot of the Black math scholars that went on to train and educate all of the a majority or a lot of Black students or the Black mathematicians that we see today. So I just wanted to point out Bob Moses in the Algebra Project, if you wanted to look further into his work.
Yes, and I was about to say, and Professor Johns typed it in, this the great civil rights leader, Bob Moses, that was a part of CORE, that was very active in working with voter registration in the South. So yes, it's the same Bob Moses. So if you actually type in, if you Google the Algebra Project, you will come up on the website, and they have all kinds of learning materials on the website, but it's a really good site. All right, so we are a little bit past time, so I'm going to just share with you all our next webinar, which will be on next Tuesday. We'll be having a book salon. So Professor Dr. Cynthia Robinson, the chair of the department, will be in discussion with Dr. Carrie Ann Eskeig, who's in education, regarding her new co-authored book, Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias Classrooms. So we invite you all for that presentation next Tuesday at 2. We want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you, Professor Dr. Watkins, for this phenomenal presentation. It's really timely because we need to really start examining how it is that we're teaching our young people about mathematics and to not be afraid of it. So thank you. And so there are all kinds of positive comments in the chat, but we want to thank everyone for spending their afternoon with us, and we look forward to seeing you again on next time.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.